Eli stood in the dimly lit workshop, her gaze fixed on the 3 peculiar eggs. They lay nestled in a tray lined with mystical symbols, each as large as a football and covered in a shell that shimmered faintly under the light. She adjusted the lens of her technomancer's visor, studying the faint aura that clung to them like a shadowy mist. She hadn't noticed it at first, but now, as she traced the contours of the eggs with her gloved fingers, the familiarity struck her. The energy was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. She'd encountered it before, back at the Shadow Realm bar, amid the swirling energies of that otherworldly place. Eli felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped back, taking in the sight before her. "Gunnar needs to see this," she murmured, carefully removing her visor and setting it on the table. Eli found Gunnar in his office, leaning over a map strewn with tactical markers. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp, casting long shadows over the walls. He looked up as she entered, his sharp blue eye locking onto her with an intensity that never seemed to waver. "Got something?" he asked, straightening. "Yeah. I think I know where those eggs came from." She crossed the room, placing a data tablet on his desk and bringing up the analysis. "It's the aura. I've felt it before, when we were at the Shadow Realm bar." Gunnar's eye narrowed as he looked over the information. "You're saying these were traded there?" Eli nodded. "I can't be certain, but it's a strong lead. That place is a black market hotspot for supernatural items, and this aura has the same resonance as some of the stuff we encountered in the bar. I think it's possible that someone moved these eggs through there recently." He let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. "That means we're dealing with inter-realm trafficking. If these eggs crossed from one realm to ours, whoever handled them has more power than we're prepared to face." "I thought as much. That's why I came to you. We need more intel. And fast." Gunnar nodded, already reaching for the secure line to contact Sophia. The thought of trafficking from sealed realms didn't sit well with him, and if the Shadow Realm bar was involved, they'd need someone on the inside. He dialed Sophia, his fingers moving swiftly over the keypad. "Sophia, it's Gunnar. We've got a situation," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "Eli's traced the origin of some items to the Shadow Realm bar. I need you to reach out to Shade. Can he meet us tonight?" Sophia's voice crackled through the speaker, calm and composed. "Understood. Shade's mentioned unusual activity there lately. He's been hearing about some risky trades. I'll set up a meeting, but fair warning, Shade knows about you. He's heard the stories." Gunnar raised an eyebrow. "Let's hope that works in our favor. Meet us near the bar in an hour." The alley near the Shadow Realm bar was cloaked in darkness, the shadows pooling thick around the damp brick walls. Eli and Gunnar stood with Sophia, their breath visible in the cold night air. A figure detached itself from the darkness, approaching them with hesitant steps. Shade's face was half hidden beneath the hood of his cloak, but his eyes, wide and wary, betrayed his nerves. Shade halted a few feet away, casting a quick glance at Sophia before focusing on Gunnar. "So, you're the one they call Gunnar," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Demon King's slayer." Gunnar gave a small nod, crossing his arms. His gaze was steady, unflinching. "That's right." Shade swallowed hard, his eyes darting back to Eli, as if for reassurance, before looking at Gunnar again. "I didn't expect to meet you in person. They say you took down Ultranacious single-handedly. The stories, well, let's just say they're legendary." "Stories tend to get exaggerated," Gunnar replied, his voice even. "But we're not here to talk about the past. We need information." Shade nodded quickly, tugging his cloak tighter around his shoulders. "Right, of course. You mentioned some eggs?" Gunnar gestured for Eli to explain. She stepped forward, her tone calm and reassuring as she described the aura she'd detected and her suspicion that the eggs had been traded at the bar. Shade listened intently, but his gaze kept flickering back to Gunnar, a mix of awe and unease in his expression. "So, these eggs," Shade said, trying to sound casual, though his voice shook slightly. "Yeah, I've heard some things. They were part of a recent transaction. Big money involved, from what I gathered. I don't know who the buyer is, but they're not your average bar patron. They're someone with enough pull to move things from the sealed realms." Gunner's expression hardened. "Who do you think it could be?" Shade hesitated, his eyes flitting between Gunner and the alley's exit, as if contemplating his escape, but he squared his shoulders, steeling himself. "I'm not sure, but if they're dealing in creatures from sealed realms, then you're dealing with someone who doesn't care about boundaries. Black Dawn, maybe. Or worse." Eli's gaze sharpened. "Worse than Black Dawn?" Shade nodded, his face pale in the faint light. "There are factions out there that make Black Dawn look like amateurs. I've heard rumors of groups that want to breach the seals completely, flood our world with creatures that should never leave their realms. If that's who you're dealing with, then this is bigger than any of us." Gunner stepped forward, and Shade instinctively took a step back. "We'll need more than rumors, Shade. Find out who's behind this and what they want. I don't care what it takes." Shade swallowed, nodding rapidly. "Understood. I'll keep my ear to the ground. And, if you don't mind, I'll be keeping out of your way." Gunner's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good choice. Now, get to it." Shade shot one last glance at Sophia, then disappeared back into the shadows, his movements quick and silent. As his footsteps faded away, Gunner looked to Eli and Sophia, his expression grim. "This is just the beginning," he said, his tone heavy with resolve. "Let's find out what's coming and make sure we're ready for it." Gunner stood in the center of the briefing room, arms crossed, his gaze shifting between Eli and Karina. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of machinery in the background. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. The mission was too important for that. "We've got intel that those eggs likely passed through the Shadow Realm bar," he began, his voice steady but intense. "It's not just some casual black market trade. Whoever moved those eggs is dealing in things from sealed realms, which means they have connections and power." Eli nodded, listening closely while Karina remained silent, her gaze focused and unwavering. "I'm sending you two in," Gunner continued, meeting Karina's eyes. "This isn't a routine intel-gathering mission. The stakes are high, and I want our best fighter there in case things get messy." He glanced at Eli, his tone softening slightly. "Eli's familiarity with the bar will give us an edge. Between the two of you, I'm confident we'll get what we need." Karina's hand drifted to the hilt of her katana, a familiar gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Gunner. "Understood," she replied, her tone as steady as his. Eli smirked, breaking the tension. "You're sending us into a den of shady dealers and supernatural creatures. Sounds like my kind of party." Gunner's lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. "Keep your wits about you. Shade gave us what he could, but if those eggs came from there, someone at that bar knows more. And remember, we can't afford to make enemies out of everyone. Keep things civil if you can." Karina gave a short nod, though her hand remained on the hilt of her katana, as if grounding herself for what lay ahead. "We'll get the answers," she said, her voice carrying an edge of resolve. Gunner took a step back, surveying them both. "Good. Move out. And, Karina," he added, his tone taking on a note of warning, "try not to cause too much trouble. I'd like to avoid a repeat of the last time we had to deal with bouncers." Eli chuckled, nudging Karina. "See, even the boss knows your trouble. Let's try to keep it low-key. For once." Karina smirked, giving Eli a look that spoke volumes. "No promises," she replied, a spark of mischief in her eyes. Gunner shook his head but said nothing more. As they turned to leave, his voice cut through the air one last time. "Be careful out there, and bring back something we can use." With that, Eli and Karina exited the room, ready to step into the shadows and uncover whatever secrets the Shadow Realm bar held. The dive bar's neon sign flickered weakly as Eli and Karina stepped through the entrance, leaving the street behind. As they stepped into the dimly lit bar, their eyes adjusted to the smoky haze and the low hum of conversation. Humans and supernatural beings in human form mingled seamlessly, their interactions punctuated by the clinking of glasses and murmured exchanges. Eli glanced around, scanning the room for any familiar faces. It didn't take long before her gaze settled on Rose, lounging at a corner table with an air of casual confidence. The silver bracelet on her wrist caught the light, a bracelet that Eli knew well. It was the magic-dampening bracelet that Gunnar and Ashley had put on her, a reminder of the encounter that had left Rose with a taste of Echo Division's control. Rose spotted Eli and raised an eyebrow, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Well, well," she drawled, her voice smooth and teasing. "Look who decided to grace us with her presence. Where's Darren? I've been missing our little talks." Eli returned the smirk, her voice laced with mock cheerfulness. "He's at home with the kids, enjoying a quiet night. It's girls' night out for us." Karina stifled a laugh as they continued past Rose's table, but Rose wasn't finished. She leaned forward, the bracelet on her wrist glinting ominously as she toyed with it. "You know, this little trinket is really cramping my style," she said, her tone both bitter and wistful. "Pass my regards along to your leader. I'll be waiting for the day we settle this." Eli shot her a calm smile. "I'll let him know. But don't get too attached to that bracelet, it suits you." With that, they moved deeper into the bar, leaving Rose's gaze trailing after them. Karina's curiosity was piqued, and she glanced at Eli as they approached the doorway to the Shadow Realm. "She doesn't seem like the kind to let a grudge go," Karina remarked, eyeing the bouncer ahead. "No, she's not," Eli replied, "but as long as that bracelet stays on, she's more bark than bite." They stepped through the doorway and the bouncer gave them a scrutinizing look, holding out his hand for their weapons. The doorway into the Shadow Realm loomed before them, guarded by a hulking bouncer who barely fit into the cramped hallway. He stood at least 7 feet tall, his skin rough like stone and his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Eli felt Karina tense beside her, a subtle shift, but one she'd come to recognize as a sign of brewing trouble. As they stepped closer, the bouncer extended one massive hand, his palm open in silent demand. Eli handed over her small enchanted dagger without a second thought. Aware that they were on borrowed hospitality, she turned to see Karina still clutching her katana, her knuckles white as her fingers tightened around the hilt. The bouncer's eyes narrowed, and the air around them seemed to thicken. Karina's gaze met his, unflinching, her expression hard as steel. It wasn't hard to see that she had no intention of handing over her weapon. "Karina," Eli murmured, trying to catch her attention, but Karina's focus was locked on the bouncer. The bouncer let out a low growl, his arm muscles tensing as he took a step forward. Eli could almost hear the unspoken challenge crackling between them. She'd seen that look in Karina's eyes before, the look that said she'd rather take on a beast twice her size than give up her weapon. Eli braced herself, wondering if they were about to be ejected from the bar before even setting foot inside. But she knew better than to let things escalate. Taking a step forward, Eli put a hand on Karina's shoulder, a casual gesture that belied her own readiness for a fight. "Come on, Karina," she said, her tone light and dripping with sarcasm. "It's not worth it. Besides, you've got that look in your eye, and I'm really not in the mood to bail you out tonight." Karina's gaze flicked to Eli, a hint of annoyance flashing across her face. "He's not getting my katana." Eli chuckled, dropping her voice to a playful whisper. "I get it. You've got attachment issues. But trust me, this guy doesn't look like he's going to budge. I'd hate to see what he'd do to that pretty face of yours." She turned her attention back to the bouncer, giving him an appraising look. "She's stubborn as hell, you know. Must be a fighter thing." The bouncer's expression softened just a fraction, and he grunted, clearly unamused but seeming less hostile. Karina still looked ready to bolt, her eyes darting between Eli and the bouncer as though calculating her odds. Eli took a step closer to the bouncer, leaning in as if sharing a secret. "Between you and me," she said conspiratorially, "she's just warming up. I don't think you want to see her get serious. The bouncer's lips twisted into what might have been a smile, at least as much of a smile as a creature of his size and stony demeanor could muster. He extended his hand again, more insistently this time. Eli gave Karina a gentle nudge, her tone softer now. Come on, Karina, you'll get it back. Let's not make this harder than it has to be. After a tense moment, Karina finally relented, letting out a resigned sigh. She unfastened the katana from her belt and handed it over, but not without a long, hard stare at the bouncer. You better take care of it, she warned, her voice low and dangerous. The bouncer accepted the weapon with a grunt, his eyes never leaving Karina's. He turned and placed the katana on a nearby rack, handling it with surprising care. Karina watched him like a hawk, her body coiled as if ready to spring at the slightest sign of disrespect to her blade. Eli gave a small sigh of relief, flashing Karina a grin. See? That wasn't so bad, she teased, her voice tinged with the dry wit she'd picked up from Darren. And look, you didn't even have to break a sweat. Karina shot her a look, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. Don't get used to it. They continued down the hall, the air around them cooling as they approached the heart of the shadow realm. The bar's true nature unfolded before them, revealing creatures in their full supernatural forms, their appearances shifting under the dim light like flickers of shadow and flame. Eli could feel the tension rolling off Karina in waves, but she knew her friend's unease went deeper than just handing over a weapon. In this world of shifting shadows and hidden threats, Karina's every instinct was on high alert, and as they moved further into the depths of the shadow realm, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them from the darkness. Eli and Karina moved deeper into the Shadow Realm bar, navigating through a crowd of beings in their true forms who spoke in hushed voices and cast curious glances their way. They passed tables cluttered with relics and potions, and the air was thick with the scent of sulphur and something sweetly metallic. At the far end of the room, an old trader sat surrounded by peculiar artifacts. His eyes, shadowed beneath a heavy hood, glinted as they approached. Eli gave Karina a nod, and they made their way over, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpet. The trader looked up, his gaze flickering from Eli to Karina. His eyes lingered on her for a moment too long, a flash of recognition crossing his face. Karina stiffened, feeling a strange prickle of familiarity, though she couldn't place where she'd seen him before. Evening, Eli said, her tone casual as she scanned the items spread out on the table. We're here about some eggs that recently changed hands, 3 to be specific, from a sealed realm. She kept her voice steady, but Karina could sense the tension beneath it. The trader's expression barely changed, but there was a flicker in his eyes, one that told her Eli was onto something. He inclined his head, his voice gravelly and low. Can't say I know what you're talking about, he replied, his gaze sliding back to Karina. I deal in a lot of things, but eggs aren't my specialty. Karina felt a jolt as his eyes met hers again, and for a moment, the world shifted. Shadows danced at the edges of her vision, and she was back in that dim room from her childhood. The scent of incense filled her nostrils, and she saw the shadowy figure reach out, felt the rush of power and the eerie sense of familiarity that threatened to overwhelm her. She snapped back to the present, her heart racing. The trader was still watching her, a knowing glint in his eyes. Eli's voice cut through her disorientation, steady and unyielding. Funny, because I picked up on your signature near those eggs, she said, her eyes narrowing. You're not the only one who can sense auras. The trader's mouth twisted into a thin smile. Ah, I see. The technomancer has been busy, he said, his gaze flicking to Eli. Fine, yes, I may have had a hand in their distribution, but their origins are none of your concern. Eli leaned forward, crossing her arms over her chest. Actually, it is our concern. Those eggs pose a threat, and you know it. Who did you sell them to? The trader shrugged, his demeanor unbothered. I sell to those who pay. It's not my job to ask questions. But his eyes darted back to Karina, and she felt the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air, as if there was something he wanted to say but didn't dare. Karina's fingers curled into fists at her sides, her pulse pounding. "And yet, you seem awfully interested in me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The trader's smile faded, and he straightened, finally breaking his silence. "Because you remind me of someone," he murmured, his tone almost regretful. "Someone who walked a similar path once. You carry shadows in you, girl. Shadows that can't be hidden, no matter how hard you try." Eli stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "Enough with the cryptic nonsense. Tell us what you know about those eggs. Who did you sell them to?" The trader's gaze lingered on Karina a moment longer before shifting to Eli. "They were destined for hands that could pay the price," he said, a dark smile curving his lips. "But if you're looking to play hero, you're already too late. The buyer has already moved them on. I was just a middleman." "Who's the buyer?" Eli demanded, her voice ice cold. The trader chuckled, a hollow sound that sent a chill down Karina's spine. "Names have power, and that is a power I am not inclined to share, but I will say this. Whoever bought those eggs knows more about what lies within them than you or I could ever understand." The answer wasn't what they wanted, but it was something. Eli gave him a final hard stare, then motioned for Karina to follow her. They walked away, leaving the trader in his shadowy corner. But Karina couldn't shake the feeling that she'd seen him somewhere before, or perhaps in another life. As they moved back toward the main area of the bar, Karina felt Eli's gaze on her. "You okay?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Karina swallowed, trying to clear the lingering sense of unease. "Fine. Just memories." She hesitated, then added, "He recognized me. I don't know how, but he did." Eli nodded, not pressing further. "Let's get out of here," she said, leading the way back to the door. "We've got enough to report to Gunner, and we need to figure out our next move." As they left the bar, Karina cast one last glance over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of the trader watching her from the shadows. She knew deep down that he held answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask yet. And somehow she knew that this wouldn't be the last time their paths would cross. As Eli and Karina made their way back to the entrance of the Shadow Realm, the familiar hulking bouncer awaited them, arms crossed, his gaze cold and impassive. Beside him was the weapons rack, where Karina's katana rested, untouched, but carefully watched over. Karina stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she reached for it. The bouncer held it out, and Karina took it with a steady hand, her fingers instinctively wrapping around the hilt. She turned the blade slightly, inspecting it for any signs of disturbance. Satisfied, she slid the katana back into its sheath with a fluid motion, her shoulders relaxing as the familiar weight settled at her side. Eli chuckled softly. "Glad to have it back?" Karina shot her a look, but there was a faint smirk tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Let's just say I feel more like myself," she replied, her voice tinged with relief. With weapons in hand, they exited the Shadow Realm, stepping back into the smoky interior of the outer bar. The crowd had thinned, but Eli's keen eyes quickly caught sight of Rose seated at a nearby table, surrounded by a group of men, each one dressed in dark, nondescript clothing. Their faces were hard, eyes fixed on Rose as she spoke, her voice low and commanding. Rose looked up as Eli and Karina passed, her gaze lingering for a moment. She offered them a sly smile, raising her glass in a silent toast, as if to acknowledge their presence without a word. Eli returned a nod, her expression neutral as she guided Karina toward the exit. The night air was a welcome change as they stepped out of the bar, the cool breeze brushing away the thick, cloying atmosphere of the Shadow Realm. They walked in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the city a quiet hum in the distance. As they headed back to the workshop, Eli cast a glance at Karina, who was still gripping the hilt of her katana, her gaze distant. "You all right?" she asked, breaking the silence. Karina nodded, though her thoughts were clearly elsewhere. "Yeah, just processing. Eli didn't push further, respecting Karina's need for silence. Whatever had passed between her and the trader had clearly shaken something loose, but Eli knew Karina would speak up when she was ready. For now they had enough to report to Gunnar, and the answers would come in time. Back at the workshop, they would regroup, analyze the intel, and decide on their next move. But as they walked through the night, each step taking them further from the shadow realm, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that their path was winding into something darker, something that would require all of their strength, and perhaps even more than that, to face. The workshop was quiet, the low hum of machinery the only sound as Eli and Karina stepped inside. Gunnar stood by the central table, a map spread before him and his brow furrowed in concentration. He looked up as they entered, his intense blue gaze shifting between them, reading their expressions in an instant. "What did you find?" he asked, his tone direct and expectant. Eli glanced at Karina, then stepped forward. "We tracked down the trader who dealt in those eggs. He wasn't exactly forthcoming, but he admitted to handling them," she began. "Apparently they were sold to someone with deep pockets. He was cagey about who, but he knows more than he let on." Gunnar's eyes narrowed. "Did you get anything else? Any leads on the buyer?" Karina shook her head. "He wouldn't give a name, but there was something strange about him." She hesitated, the memory of the trader's knowing gaze flickering through her mind. "I think he recognized me. I had a flashback, a memory from when I was a kid. I don't know what it means, but it felt like he knew exactly who I was." Gunnar's expression darkened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "We'll have to look into that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "If he recognized you, he may know more about your past than you do." Karina nodded, her gaze steady. "There's one more thing. On the way out, we saw Rose. She was with a group of men, and she looked comfortable, confident, like she was in charge." Gunnar's eyes sharpened, his posture straightening. "Rose? At the Shadow Realm bar?" "Yeah," Eli confirmed. "She even gave us a little toast on our way out. I don't know who those men were, but they weren't your average bar crowd. She's clearly up to something, and with that bracelet on, she should be on a pretty tight leash." But it didn't look like it was holding her back much. Gunnar exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Rose has always been a wild card. We need to keep an eye on her, especially if she's gathering people around her. She could be planning something, and the last thing we need is another rogue element in the mix." He looked back at the map, then at Eli and Karina, a sense of resolve settling over him. "We're dealing with bigger forces than we realized. Between those eggs and whatever Rose is up to, this is about more than just trafficking. There's something connecting all these pieces, and we need to figure out what it is before it blows up in our faces." Eli nodded. "Agreed. And with Rose, we'll need to watch our backs. She might not have her full powers, but she's clever enough to be dangerous without them." Karina stepped closer to the table, her fingers brushing over the map. "So what's the next move?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension simmering beneath the surface. Gunnar looked between them, his gaze resolute. "We dig deeper. I'll reach out to our contacts and see if anyone else knows about these eggs and their connection to the sealed realms. As for Rose, we'll have someone shadow her. If she's planning something, we'll find out soon enough." He turned back to Eli and Karina, his expression softening slightly. "Good work. Get some rest while you can. Things are only going to get more complicated from here." They nodded, the weight of the mission settling heavily on their shoulders. As they headed toward the exit, Eli glanced back at Gunnar, a spark of determination in her eyes. She knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, as a team. But in the back of her mind, the image of Rose and the memory of the trader lingered, reminders that their world was darker and more tangled than any of them had anticipated.
All right, you've made it this far. That means either you like what you're seeing, or you're lost. Either way, no harm in sticking around, right? Go on, hit that subscribe button, join the team, and while you're at it, hit like, because, let's be honest, you're already invested. And the bell? That's for you if you don't want to miss any of the action. You wouldn't want me to come find you. See you soon. And remember, once you're in, you're family.